January 2nd, 1941. At the Peenemunde West testing facility on the windswept Baltic coast, the clock struck 10 a.m. as a small, tailless aircraft was wheeled out from a high-security hangar. It looked less like a fighter and more like a smooth white seed, devoid of the jagged angles and spinning propellers that defined the era. This was the DFS 194, the direct ancestor of the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, and the men watching it understood that they were witnessing the birth of a terrifying new age of flight. For the Luftwaffe, this was not merely an experiment in aerodynamics. It was the beginning of a desperate gamble to produce a weapon that could outfly anything the Allied powers could dream of putting into the sky. The genesis of the Komet was rooted in the radical visions of Alexander Lippisch, a man who believed that the traditional tailplane was an aerodynamic burden. He envisioned a delta-wing interceptor that could slice through the air with minimal drag, powered not by a standard combustion engine, but by the raw, unbridled fury of a rocket. By 1 p.m. on that cold January day, the test pilot Heini Dittmar had already completed the final cockpit checks, his breathing shallow in the cramped space. When the rocket ignited, it was not the rhythmic thrum of a piston engine that filled the air, but a deafening, continuous roar that shook the very ground of the testing facility. The aircraft didn't just take off, it vanished into the clouds, climbing at a rate that seemed to defy the laws of physics. As the war progressed and the Allied bombing campaign began to tear the heart out of German industry, the need for the Komet moved from a scientific curiosity to a military necessity. By early 1943, the situation for the German interior had become critical. The standard Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters were struggling to reach the altitudes of the heavy bomber streams quickly enough to make a difference. The Luftwaffe needed a point defense interceptor, a machine that could sit on a runway, wait for the sirens to sound, and be among the enemy formations in less than 3 minutes. This requirement led to the perfection of the Walter HWK 109-509 engine, a piece of engineering that was as brilliant as it was lethal to those who operated it. The engine relied on 2 chemical components that were nightmares to handle: T-stoff and C-stoff. T-stoff was a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide that would spontaneously combust if it touched any organic material, including the pilot's flight suit or his skin. C-stoff was a toxic mixture of methanol and hydrazine hydrate. At 2:15 p.m. during a routine ground test later in the development cycle, a small leak from a fuel line caused a reaction so violent that it leveled a portion of the test stand, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. The pilots knew that they were sitting on a literal powder keg. If a Komet flipped over during a rough landing, or if a fuel tank cracked during combat, the pilot would not just die. He would be dissolved or incinerated before he could even reach for the canopy latch. The aerodynamic design of the Komet was equally uncompromising. To achieve the required speeds, Lippisch eliminated the heavy landing gear entirely. The aircraft took off on a 2-wheeled dolly that was supposed to be jettisoned once the plane reached a certain altitude. However, if the dolly failed to drop, or if it bounced back up after being released, it could strike the fuselage and cause a catastrophic mid-air explosion. For the return journey, the Komet was designed to glide back to Earth and land on a retractable steel skid. By 3 p.m. during a typical sortie, the pilot would be out of fuel, turning his high-speed rocket into a heavy, unpowered glider. At this moment, he was at his most vulnerable, a sitting duck for any Allied escort fighter that happened to spot the tiny shape descending toward the airfield. Despite these horrors, the Komet represented a peak of technological achievement that was decades ahead of its time. It was the first aircraft to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour, a feat that felt like science fiction in an age where most planes still used fabric-covered control surfaces. But this brilliance was harnessed for a regime that had lost its grip on reality, leading to a weapon that was arguably more dangerous to its own pilots than to the enemy it was meant to destroy. The Me 163 was a project born of a frantic, almost religious belief in technology as a savior for a dying cause. The legacy of the Komet is not one of military victory, as it accounted for very few confirmed kills throughout the war. Instead, its legacy is one of scientific hubris and the tragic cost of innovation under pressure. It pushed the boundaries of what a human being could do in the cockpit, providing the foundation for the supersonic aircraft and space vehicles that would follow in the post-war era. Yet, it remains a haunting symbol of the Third Reich's desperation, a sleek, beautiful, and incredibly fast machine that was, at its core, a suicide mission wrapped in the guise of a miracle weapon. It stands as a reminder that the most advanced technology, when forged in the fires of fanaticism and desperation, often leaves behind nothing but ash and the echoes of those who were sacrificed in its name. July 2, 1941. At the Peenemunde West research facility, a thick, white plume of steam erupted from a test stand, signaling the birth of a propulsion system that would defy the laws of conventional aviation. This was the beginning of the Walter Eck-WK 109-509 engine, the heart of the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. While other aircraft of the era relied on the predictable combustion of high-octane gasoline, the Komet was powered by a chemical marriage so volatile that it bordered on the suicidal. To understand why this aircraft was as much a threat to its pilots as it was to Allied bombers, one must look deep into the glass-lined tanks and specialized valves that housed the most dangerous propellants ever put into a combat aircraft. The secret to the Komet's incredible speed lay in two substances known as T-stoff and C-stoff. T-stoff was a solution of 80% hydrogen peroxide stabilized with phosphoric acid. It was a potent oxidizer, clear and seemingly harmless like water, yet it was capable of dissolving organic matter in seconds. If it touched wood, cotton, or even simple dust, it caused immediate spontaneous combustion. C-stoff was the fuel, a toxic mixture of methanol, hydrazine hydrate, and water. When these two liquids met, they didn't just burn. They reacted hypergolically. This meant they ignited instantly upon contact, without the need for a spark or a flame. The energy released was immense, but the challenge of keeping these two substances apart until the exact moment of ignition was a logistical nightmare that claimed lives before the aircraft even left the ground. Imagine a ground crew at 11 a.m. on a sweltering August day in 1944. They are draped in non-reactive rubberized suits that trap the heat, making every movement a struggle against exhaustion. The refueling process was a choreographed dance with death. First, the T-stoff tankers would approach, their hoses carefully rinsed with massive amounts of water. Once the oxidizer was loaded, the entire area was hosed down again to ensure not a single drop remained on the tarmac. Only then could the C-stoff tankers arrive. If even a trace amount of the two chemicals met outside the combustion chamber, the resulting explosion would vaporize the aircraft and everyone within 50 feet. The complexity was so high that ground crews often felt they were handling unexploded ordnance rather than preparing a fighter for a mission. Once in the air, the pilot sat sandwiched between these two chemical demons. Behind his head was a tank of T-stoff. Beneath his feet and to his sides were tanks of C-stoff. The plumbing was a labyrinth of glass and special alloys, as standard rubber or copper would be eaten away or cause a catastrophic reaction. During a high-speed climb, the G-forces could cause the fuel to slosh, leading to a flame-out. At 2:15 p.m. during a typical interception, a Komet pilot would be a silver streak against the blue, moving at nearly 600 miles per hour. While the Allied bomber crews stared in disbelief at a machine they couldn't even track with their guns. But that speed came at the cost of stability. The fuel consumption was so ravenous that the pilot had only 8 minutes of powered flight before the tanks ran dry, turning the rocket into a heavy, vulnerable glider. The horror of leaks is perhaps the darkest chapter of the Komet's history. There are accounts from the testing phases that haunt the annals of aviation. In one instance, a pilot made a rough landing that caused a T-stoff line to rupture inside the fuselage. By the time the ground crew reached the cockpit, there was no pilot left to rescue. The highly concentrated peroxide had leaked into the cockpit, and because the pilot's protective suit had a microscopic tear, the chemical had literally dissolved him. This was the terrifying reality of the Komet. It was an aircraft that demanded total perfection from its ground crews and its pilots, in a war where perfection was an impossible luxury. Helmut Walter, the designer of the engine, was a visionary whose work was ahead of the materials available to him. He sought to harness the power of a rocket to overcome the limitations of the piston engine, providing the Luftwaffe with an interceptor that could reach 30,000 feet in mere minutes. The science of the Komet was a direct precursor to the V-2 rocket and, eventually, the vehicles that would take humanity into orbit. The hypergolic propellants developed in these secret labs would become the standard for maneuvering thrusters on spacecraft for decades to come. However, the legacy of T-Stoff and C-Stoff is not one of triumph, but of a terrifying intersection between genius and madness. As we look back on the charred remains of the Komet program, we see more than just an engineering failure. We see the ultimate expression of a regime that had lost its humanity in the pursuit of a miracle weapon. The Komet was a beautiful bird of prey, but its blood was a caustic poison that consumed everything it touched. It remains a testament to the fact that progress, when divorced from ethics and born of pure desperation, often creates a monster that destroys its creator. The echoes of the Komet's roar are not just the sounds of a rocket engine, but the story of a generation sacrificed on the altar of a lost cause, leaving us to reflect on a machine that was as brilliant as it was lethal. It stands as a haunting reminder that in the heat of total war, the line between an engineering breakthrough and a death trap is often written in the ashes of those who dared to fly. January 1941, Peenemunde, where the chilling Baltic winds seemed to whisper warnings of the madness about to unfold. This was the birthplace of the Me-163 Komet, a place where traditional aviation rules were shredded and thrown into the furnace of necessity. To fly the Komet, the Luftwaffe did not just need pilots. They needed men who were comfortable sitting on a powder keg with a lit fuse. The training program for Airprobungskommando 16 was a descent into a scientific purgatory. It began with glider trials, as the Komet's unique tailless design defied everything a pilot knew about aerodynamics. At 9 a.m. on a typical training day, a pilot would be towed into the sky by a Messerschmitt 1 and 10, only to be released into a silent, terrifying glide. Without an engine, the Komet was a brick with wings, and the landing was a life-or-death gamble on a retractable wooden skid. If the skid did not deploy, or if the pilot came in too fast, the impact would shatter his spine against the seat. But the real terror was not the flight itself. It was the volatile soul of the machine. The T-Stoff and C-Stoff fuels were so corrosive that they could dissolve organic tissue upon contact. Pilots were forced to wear special protective suits made of a non-organic fiber, resembling something out of a science fiction nightmare. Yet these suits offered little more than a psychological shield. Even a pin-sized leak in the fuel lines meant the cockpit would fill with fumes that would melt the pilot's lungs before he could even signal for help. At 2 p.m. during a routine ground test, a single drop of leaked T-Stoff could cause an entire hangar to erupt in a spontaneous, white-hot explosion. The pilots lived in a state of constant, low-level dread, knowing that their own aircraft was as much an enemy as any Allied bomber. The physical requirements were unlike anything seen in the history of warfare. Because the Komet could reach altitudes of 30,000 feet in just 3 minutes, the rapid change in air pressure was catastrophic for the human body. Medical officers strictly regulated the pilots' diets, banning any food that could cause intestinal gas. They knew that at high altitudes, trapped gas would expand so violently it could rupture a pilot's organs. This was the reality of the lethal learning curve. A pilot's life depended as much on what he had for breakfast as it did on his reflexes at the controls. At 11:15 a.m., a pilot might be sitting in a low-pressure chamber, watching his own blood begin to boil as the doctors simulated the Komet's ascent. It was a test of endurance that many failed before they even touched a joystick. Heini Dittmar, the lead test pilot, became a living leg among this small circle of condemned men. At 3 p.m. on October 2, 1941, he sat in the cockpit of the Me-163A, fueled for a record attempt. When the rocket ignited, the Komet did not just take off. It vanished into the sky like a bullet. Dittmar reached a staggering 1,003 kilometers per hour, becoming the first human to graze the sound barrier. But the price of this achievement was nearly paid in blood. As the aircraft approached Mach 1, the aerodynamics failed, and the Komet began a violent, uncontrollable pitch. Dittmar survived, but the incident proved that they were flying in a realm where physics no longer behaved according to the textbooks. Tragedy was the most consistent teacher in the Komet program. There is the haunting account of a pilot whose landing was slightly too jarring, causing a fuel line to rupture. The T-Stoff flooded the cockpit, and by the time the ground crew reached the wreckage at 4:30 p.m., there was nothing left of the pilot but a gelatinous sludge. The chemicals had quite literally dissolved him inside his flight suit. This was the shadow that hung over every trainee. They were not just learning to fly. They were learning how to die in the name of a technological miracle that the Reich hoped would turn the tide of the war. As we look back at the young men who volunteered for this mission, we are forced to confront the terrible allure of the cutting edge. They were pioneers of the rocket age, yet they were also victims of a regime that viewed human life as a replaceable component in a failing machine. The legacy of the Me-163 is not one of aerial victory, for it claimed more of its own pilots than it did enemy bombers. Instead, its legacy is a dark monument to the limits of engineering when it is divorced from the preservation of life. It serves as a poignant reminder that the pursuit of the impossible, when fueled by desperation, often leads only to the graveyard. The Komet was a spark of genius in a sky of darkness, but it was a spark that consumed everyone it touched, leaving behind only the cold, silent ruins of a future that should never have been built. July 28, 1944, over the heavy industrial landscape of Merseburg, Germany, the arrival of the Messerschmitt 163 Komet marked a terrifying departure from the traditional dogfights of the Second World War. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the crews of the American 92nd Bomb Group looked out from their B-17 flying fortresses to see something that defied logic. Streaking upward from the green fields below were tiny, bat-winged shapes trailing long plumes of white smoke, moving at velocities that made the standard Luftwaffe Bf-109s look like they were standing still. This was the debut of the world's only operational rocket-powered fighter, a machine born from the desperate intersection of genius and catastrophe. The operational reality of the Komet was defined by a clock that ticked towards zero from the moment of ignition. At 9 a.m. at the airfield in Brandis, the ground crews dressed in heavy, protective rubber suits, looking more like deep-sea divers than mechanics. They were handling the most dangerous substances ever put into an aircraft. T-Stoff, a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol, were hypergolic. This meant that the moment they touched, they ignited spontaneously. There was no room for a spill, no margin for a leaking valve. A single drop of T-Stoff on a piece of cloth or organic matter would cause it to burst into flames, and if it touched a pilot's skin, it would begin to dissolve his tissue instantly. Once the pilot was bolted into the cockpit and the liquid fire was pumped into the tanks, he became a component in a volatile chemical reaction. When the throttle was opened, the Walter rocket motor produced a thrust that slammed the pilot back into his seat with a force that threatened to black out his vision. By 9:15 a.m., a Komet could be sitting at 30,000 feet, looking down on the bomber streams that had only just crossed the border. This vertical climb was the Komet's greatest strength, allowing it to bypass the escorting P-51 Mustangs entirely. However, this incredible performance came at a cost that was measured in mere seconds. The Me-163 carried only enough fuel for about 6 minutes of powered flight. This created a target acquisition crisis that was virtually insurmountable for even the most veteran pilots. As the German pilot leveled off at 550 miles per hour, he was closing in on a formation of bombers moving at 200 miles per hour. The relative closing speed was nearly 350 miles per hour. This meant that a bomber, which appeared as a small dot in the distance, would fill the entire windscreen in a matter of heartbeats. To land a killing blow, the pilot had to lead his target and fire his twin 30mm cannons. But because the Mk108 cannons had such a slow muzzle velocity, the shells traveled in a looping, lazy arc. At Komet speeds, the pilot had less than 2 seconds to identify his target, align his aircraft, compensate for the shell drop, and fire before he zoomed past by 9:20 a.m. Most pilots found they had already overshot the formation without firing a single effective shot. To try again, the pilot had to pull a massive high-G turn that strained the wooden wings of the aircraft and drained the last of the fuel. If he was lucky, he could squeeze out one more pass. If not, the rocket motor would give a final, spluttering cough and die. Suddenly, the roar that had been vibrating through his skull was replaced by a haunting, whistling wind. The Komet was now a glider. It was no longer a high-tech interceptor. It was a vulnerable bird of prey with clipped wings, struggling to maintain enough energy to reach home. The transition to unpowered flight was when the Komet became a victim of its own success. Allied pilots quickly learned the pattern. They would not bother chasing the Komet during its rocket-powered ascent. Instead, they would wait for the white smoke trail to vanish. At 9:25 a.m., as the silent Komet began its long, spiraling descent toward Brandis, the Mustangs would dive from the clouds. The German pilot, now fighting the heavy controls of a dead aircraft, had to perform a series of precision maneuvers to line up with the landing strip while evading machine gun fire. Because the Komet had jettisoned its takeoff wheels to save weight, it had to land on a single retractable metal skid. A landing in a Komet was a second date with death. If the pilot came in too fast, the skid could snap, flipping the plane and crushing the man inside. If he came in too slow, he would stall and drop like a stone. Most terrifying of all was the risk of residual fuel. If even a small amount of T-stuff remained in the tanks, the jolt of landing could cause the aircraft to vanish in a ball of white-hot fire. The pilots were essentially sitting on a bomb that was designed to explode upon contact with the Earth. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant grinding fear that the very machine intended to save the Reich would instead be the instrument of their own gruesome. Despite its revolutionary design, the Komet's combat record was abysmal. It claimed only 9 confirmed kills throughout the entire war, while losing 14 of its own to accidents and many more to enemy fire during the landing phase. It was a weapon of extreme statistics that failed to produce a meaningful result. The target acquisition crisis highlighted the fatal flaw of the entire project. It was an aircraft that had outrun the human capacity to use it. It was a glimpse into a future of supersonic combat, but it lacked the guidance systems and the reliable propulsion that would eventually make such speeds viable. The legacy of the Me-163 Komet is one of tragic brilliance. It stands as a monument to what happens when engineering is pushed to its absolute breaking point by the hands of desperation. It was a beautiful, lethal arrow shot into a storm. A craft that reached for the stars but was dragged down by the weight of its own volatility. It serves as a poignant reminder that the pursuit of the impossible, when fueled by the fires of a losing war, often leads only to the graveyard. The Komet was a spark of genius in a sky of darkness, but it was a spark that consumed everyone it touched, leaving behind only the cold, silent ruins of a future that arrived too early and cost too much. It remains a haunting testament to the human spirit's drive to innovate, even when that innovation is nothing more than a faster way to die. August 16, 1944, at the Brandis airfield near Leipzig, a lone Messerschmitt 163 Komet desks from the stratosphere in a haunting, powerless glide. The roaring rocket engine, which only minutes ago had propelled the pilot to the edge of space at speeds never before witnessed by man, is now silent. The pilot is no longer a hunter. He is a captive of gravity, steering a 3-ton wooden and metal egg toward a narrow grass strip. This was the moment every Komet pilot feared most. To save weight, the Me-163 had jettisoned its wheels upon takeoff, leaving it with nothing but a retractable metal skid for landing. If the pilot misjudged his approach by even a few meters, or if the skid failed to lock, the result was almost always fatal. But the danger of the impact was often overshadowed by the invisible killer lurking within the fuselage. As the clock struck 3 p.m. on that sweltering afternoon, ground crews watched in silent terror as a returning aircraft hit a small bump on the runway. It was a minor jolt, the kind that any other fighter would have shrugged off, but for the Komet it was a death sentence. The aircraft carried 2 highly volatile chemicals, T-stoff, a concentrated hydrogen peroxide solution, and C-stoff, a hydrazine hydrate and methanol mix. When combined, they ignited spontaneously. Even worse, T-stoff was a terrifyingly corrosive oxidizer. If a landing was rough enough to rupture the internal tanks, the pilot found himself trapped in a tiny cockpit with a substance that dissolved human flesh upon contact. There are accounts from rescue teams who reached crashed Komets only to find that the pilot had literally been liquefied inside his flight suit, leaving behind nothing but a horrific, gelatinous remains and a set of goggles. The pilots were required to wear special protective suits made of non-organic fibers like nylon or PVC, but these were rudimentary and often failed under the high-pressure leaks that occurred during a crash. At 3:15 p.m., after one such landing failure, a recovery team approached a stationary Komet that had seemingly landed safely, only to find the pilot slumped over the controls. A small leak in a T-stoff line had filled the cockpit with corrosive fumes. By the time they opened the canopy, the acidic vapor had already begun its work on the man's lungs and eyes. This was the dark reality of the Me-163. It was a machine that demanded perfection from its pilots while offering them 1,000 different ways to die in return for a few seconds of tactical advantage. The landing skid itself was a masterpiece of flawed engineering. It was intended to act as a shock absorber, but in practice, it often acted as a catapult. If the aircraft landed with even a slight tilt, it could ground loop, snapping the wings and rupturing the fuel lines. Because the Komet was a glider during its return, the pilot had only one chance. There was no go-around, no second attempt. If a B-17 bomber formation happened to be over the airfield as the Komet was landing, the pilot was a sitting duck, unable to maneuver or deaf himself. He was forced to glide through a storm of lead, praying that the volatile remnants of his fuel wouldn't be sparked by a single incendiary bullet. Consider the fate of Joschke Pers, one of the most experienced Komet pilots of the Luftwaffe. During a routine flight, his engine cut out shortly after takeoff, a common occurrence for the temperamental rocket motor. He attempted to turn back and land, but his aircraft struck the ground with more force than the skid could handle. The aircraft did not explode in a fireball. Instead, a leak developed. When the ground crew reached him, they found that the T-stoff had flooded the cockpit. Pers was still alive, but he was being dissolved from the bottom up. It is a level of horror that transcends the typical casualties of war. These men weren't just fighting the Allies. They were fighting a machine that was fundamentally hostile to their very existence. By 4 p.m., the ground crews at Brandis were often exhausted not from the labor of maintenance, but from the psychological toll of watching their comrades disappear into the sky in what many considered to be a suicide mission in all but name. The Me-163 was born from a desperate need to stop the relentless Allied bombing campaigns, a silver bullet designed to pierce the heart of the American bomber streams. Yet, for every Allied bomber the Komet brought down, it seemed to claim the life of its own pilot through a mechanical failure or a chemical catastrophe. The aircraft was a testament to the fact that during the final years of the conflict, the German High Command had lost its grip on the value of human life, pursuing technological miracles at the cost of the very soldiers they were supposed to protect. The legacy of the Me-163 Komet is not one of aerial victory, but of a terrifying glimpse into a future that the world was not yet ready for. It remains a haunting symbol of the intersection between genius and madness. While it paved the way for the rocket-powered research aircraft that would eventually break the sound barrier and reach for the stars, its path was paved with the agony of those who flew it. It was a spark of brilliance in a darkening sky, a machine that moved faster than any other, yet could never outrun the inevitable collapse of the regime that created it. Ultimately, the Komet serves as a poignant reminder that when innovation is fueled by desperation rather than wisdom, the price of progress is often paid in the most horrific currency imaginable. It was a magnificent, terrifying failure, a rocket to nowhere that left nothing behind but the cold chemical scent of a tragedy that arrived too early and cost far too much. May 8, 1945, at Husum Airfield in northern Germany, the heavy silence of a shattered nation was finally beginning to settle over the landscape. British soldiers, moving with the cautious curiosity of those who had survived the unthinkable, walked through the charred remains of the Luftwaffe's final defenses. In a corner of a camouflaged hangar, they discovered a cluster of small, wing-shaped craft that looked like they belonged to a century yet to come. These were the Me-163 Komets, the rocket-powered ghosts of a dying regime, sitting motionless as the world they were meant to death crumbled into dust. To the soldiers, they were mere war prizes. But to the history of human achievement, they represented something far more complex. They were the physical manifestation of a bridge between the propeller-driven past and a terrifying, high-velocity future. As we look back on the legacy of the Komet, we are forced to navigate the blurred line between a scientific marvel and a moral catastrophe. It is a story that refuses to be categorized simply as a failure or a success, for it was both in the most extreme sense imaginable. The Komet was the first aircraft to truly touch the hem of the supersonic age, at a time when the fastest Allied fighters were struggling to maintain stability near 450 miles per hour. The Komet was routinely screaming through the air at speeds that defied belief. In one unofficial test flight, it clocked over 700 miles per hour, a feat that would not be officially matched by the rest of the world for years. It was a leap in aerodynamics that fundamentally changed how we understood the behavior of air at high velocities. The delta wing configuration, the lack of a traditional tail, and the reliance on raw rocket thrust were all concepts that would eventually become the foundation of the Cold War aviation race. When American engineers at 2 p.m. on a bright afternoon in 1947 watched the X-1 break the sound barrier, they were standing on the shoulders of the men who had designed the Komet. The scientific data harvested from captured German airframes under Operation Paperclip became the DNA of the modern jet age. Yet, this legacy of innovation is inextricably linked to a legacy of human sacrifice that borders on the grotesque. We must remember that the Komet was not developed in a vacuum of pure scientific inquiry. It was born from the desperation of a regime that had run out of time and resources. The pilots who climbed into that cramped, claustrophobic cockpit were not just warriors. They were human test subjects in an experiment where the variables were death and more death. To fly the Komet was to accept a pact with a temperamental god of chemistry. The T-Stoff and C-Stoff fuels were so volatile that a landing jarred slightly too hard at 4:30 p.m. could result in a pilot being dissolved alive inside his flight suit before the ground crews could even reach the wreck. The machine was a predator that was just as likely to consume its master as it was its prey. This is the dark reflection of high-tech ambition when it is stripped of any regard for the value of life. The tragedy of the Komet is that it was a weapon of incredible sophistication used to serve a cause of incredible depravity. It represents a moment in history where human intelligence outpaced human wisdom. The engineers who perfected the rocket motor and the sleek, tailless airframe were brilliant, but their brilliance was harnessed to a machine of destruction that ultimately achieved nothing of strategic value. The Komet shot down very few bombers, and it certainly did not stop the tide of the Allied advance. Instead, it functioned as a spectacular, fiery drain on Germany's remaining strength. It was a weapon that required the highest level of craftsmanship and the most dangerous fuels, all to provide a few minutes of flight that rarely ed in a successful mission. It was the ultimate wonder weapon that proved to be a hollow promise, a gleaming technological miracle that could not hide the rot of the system that created it. As we see the surviving Komets today, resting quietly in the halls of the Smithsonian or the Royal Air Force Museum, they have been scrubbed clean of the acrid, chemical scent that once defined them. They look like symbols of progress, elegant and forward-thinking. But we must never look at them without remembering the cost. We must think of the young men who waited on the runways, their hearts racing as the countdown reached its, knowing that the next 8 minutes would either be the pinnacle of their lives or the moment of their incineration. The Komet is a reminder that technology is never neutral. It carries with it the intent of its creators and the desperation of its era. It serves as a poignant warning for our own age, where the drive for the next great breakthrough often ignores the ethical ground upon which that breakthrough is built. The legacy of the rocket fighter is one of a magnificent, terrifying failure. It was a rocket to nowhere, a machine that moved faster than any other but could never outrun the inevitable collapse of the ideology that fueled it. It stands as a monument to the heights human genius can reach when pushed to the absolute limit, and a cautionary tale of the depths of suffering we will yaw when that genius is divorced from empathy. In the final accounting, the Komet was a spark of brilliance in a darkening sky, a flash of light that arrived too early and cost far too much. It remains a phantom of the Luftwaffe, a silent witness to a time when the world went mad, leaving us with the haunting realization that the price of progress is sometimes paid in the most horrific currency imaginable. The wings of the Komet are frozen in time, a permanent shadow over the history of flight, reminding us that while we may reach for the stars, we must never lose our humanity in the ascent.